Aretha Franklin got 45 minutes. Kirk Franklin received a full set. Yolanda Adams commanded prime time. But Whitney Houston, once the most powerful voice in America, was allocated just 15 minutes at Detroit's biggest benefit concert for Hurricane Katrina survivors. What happened in those 15 minutes would remind everyone why they called her The Voice. November 18th, 2006. Joe Louis Arena, Detroit, Michigan. 20,000 people filled every seat, most wearing their Sunday best despite the Saturday evening hour. These weren't typical concert goers. These were church families, community leaders, and Hurricane Katrina evacuees who had rebuilt their lives in Detroit. They'd come not for entertainment, but for healing, for hope. Backstage, the hierarchy was unmistakable. Aretha Franklin moved through the space like the queen of soul she was, her presence commanding immediate respect. Kirk Franklin held court with infectious energy, his laugh filling the corridors. Yolanda Adams radiated the serene authority of gospel royalty. And somewhere in a corner, almost unnoticed, sat Whitney Houston. She'd arrived that afternoon with minimal fanfare. No entourage, no handlers, just her voice coach and a single bodyguard. The other musicians acknowledged her politely, but conversations somehow shifted when she approached. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was something more complicated. Uncertainty. "What's she doing here?" Whitney had overheard a backup singer whisper to another. "This is about faith, not pop songs." Another voice chimed in, barely audible but cutting. "Heard she wanted to do I Will Always Love You." Aretha had to talk her out of it. "Girl thinks she's still in 1992. A third person added with a dismissive laugh. "Wonder if she can even hit those high notes anymore. Been rough few years for Miss Whitney." The whispers seemed to multiply in the corridor, each one sharper than the last. Whitney pretended not to hear, but each comment landed like a small weight on her chest. She'd spent the past few years building walls around her sensitivity, but in moments like these, the old wounds opened easily. The girl from Newark who'd once sung in New Hope Baptist Church was still there beneath the designer clothes and carefully applied makeup. She found a quiet corner near the equipment cases and sat down, not to practice, but to think. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure what she was doing here either. Her management had pushed for the appearance. "Good for your image," they'd said. "Shows you're still connected to your roots." But Whitney had learned to distrust anything done purely for image. What had really drawn her here was a phone call from Aretha Franklin herself. Not through managers or assistants, but the Queen calling Whitney's home number, speaking in that distinctive voice about families displaced by the hurricane, about communities torn apart by forces beyond their control. "Whitney, baby," Aretha had said, "these people need to hear from someone who understands what it means to rise above circumstances." The skepticism was understandable. Whitney's recent years had been turbulent. Tabloid headlines about her personal struggles had overshadowed her artistry. Her last album hadn't performed as expected. Critics questioned whether her voice had lost its power. Some gospel purists had never forgiven her crossover success, viewing it as abandonment of her sacred roots. But hope for Detroit felt different. When Aretha Franklin had called her personally, something in the older woman's voice had reached through Whitney's uncertainty. This wasn't about career rehabilitation. Hurricane Katrina evacuees were starting over in Detroit. Families separated from everything they'd known. Whitney understood displacement, the feeling of losing your foundation. Still, backstage at Joe Louis Arena, Whitney could feel the weight of skeptical glances. Gospel musicians respected her talent, but questioned her commitment. Pop critics had written premature obituaries for her career. Church folks weren't sure she still belonged in their world. Where exactly did Whitney Houston fit in 2006? The evening's performances had been building energy steadily. Local Detroit gospel choirs opened with power that had the crowd on their feet. Kirk Franklin delivered his signature blend of traditional gospel and contemporary beats. But the real electricity came when Aretha took the stage. These church folks knew every word to Amazing Grace. They'd grown up with the Queen's voice soundtrack their Sunday mornings. Whitney watched from the wings, studying the crowd's reactions. These people weren't here for pop anthems or show business spectacle. They needed music that acknowledged their struggles, validated their pain, and offered genuine hope. As her 15-minute slot approached, Whitney felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not nervousness, but a peculiar clarity about what needed to happen. During Kirk Franklin's set, Whitney noticed something others might have missed. When Kirk sang about God's faithfulness through trials, the crowd didn't just listen. They testified back, calling out, "Yes, and that's right." These were their stories being told through gospel harmonies. Between sets, Whitney overheard conversations that cut straight to her core. A woman telling her friend, "Lost everything in the storm, but Detroit's been good to us." A teenager explaining to his grandmother how different their new church felt from the one they'd left in New Orleans. These weren't abstract charity cases. These were real families rebuilding their lives with faith as their foundation. Whitney realized that her 15 minutes wasn't about proving herself to critics. It was about acknowledging that these people's faith mattered. 20 minutes before her set, Whitney approached a family backstage, guests of Aretha Franklin. The family consisted of a middle-aged couple and their adult daughter, all wearing their finest clothes despite obvious economy in their choices. "Excuse me," Whitney said quietly. "I'm about to go on stage. Mind if I ask what you'd want to hear?" The husband looked surprised, then thoughtful. "Something that says God hasn't forgotten us," he replied. "Something that says our faith still matters, even when everything else got washed away." Their daughter looked directly at Whitney and said, "Sing something real, something that sounds like it came from someone who actually knows what Sunday morning feels like." "Whitney, you're up in 5, a stage manager announced. Aretha Franklin appeared beside her, placing a gentle hand on Whitney's shoulder. "Baby," she said quietly, "sing them something that comes from your heart, not your head." Whitney nodded, adjusting her earpiece. No elaborate staging tonight, no backup dancers, just her and the songs that had first brought her to people's attention when she was still Whitney Houston singing in her mother's church. The walk to the stage felt eternal. Behind her, the gospel establishment waited to see if this pop crossover could still speak to their world. Ahead, 20,000 people who'd been disappointed by politicians and insurance companies that seemed determined to forget their pain. Whitney stepped into the spotlight at 9:17 p.m. The crowd offered polite applause, but their body language remained reserved. She could see skepticism in their faces. This was the woman who'd conquered pop radio, who'd starred in Hollywood movies, who lived in a world far from church pews and Sunday potlucks. "Good evening," Whitney said into the microphone, her voice carrying that familiar warmth. "I grew up not far from here in Newark. My mother, Sissy, made sure I understood that every gift comes with responsibility." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Then, without warning, she began singing, "His Eye is on the Sparrow," a capella. No instrumentation, no production, just her voice filling the arena with pure, unadorned gospel truth. The effect was immediate and electric. This wasn't the Whitney Houston of pop anthems. This was the voice that had been trained in New Hope Baptist Church, the instrument that had been shaped by generations of gospel tradition. The crowd's polite attention transformed into awe. As Whitney's voice soared through the familiar lyrics about God's care for even the smallest creatures, something magical happened in Joe Louis Arena. 20,000 people forgot about her celebrity, her struggles, her tabloid headlines. They heard only the voice that had always been there, the gift that transcended everything else. In the third row, a woman who'd lost her home in New Orleans began crying quietly, not performative emotion, but deep recognition of someone sharing her faith language. Her husband reached for her hand, and Whitney could see from the stage that he was fighting back tears too. When the song ended, the silence was profound. Then slowly applause began building, not as appreciation for a performance, but as gratitude for a ministry moment. For her second song, Whitney looked out at the crowd and spoke directly to them. "This one's for everyone who's ever wondered if God still hears them when everything falls apart." The opening notes of Greatest Love of All began, but Whitney transformed it completely. Gone was the pop production. In its place was something that sounded like testimony, like a mother talking to her children about finding strength in impossible circumstances. "I believe the children are our future," she sang, but now the words carried weight they'd never had in radio rotation. In this room full of families who'd lost everything but refused to lose hope, the lyrics became prayer. Something extraordinary happened before Whitney reached the chorus. Voices from the crowd joined in, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. By the time she reached learning to love yourself, it is the greatest love of all, thousands of voices were lifting the words as affirmation. What happened next became one of those moments that people would remember for the rest of their lives. Whitney stopped singing and let the crowd continue, their voices creating a sound unlike anything Joe Louis Arena had ever heard. But it wasn't just the volume. It was the quality of the singing. These weren't fans showing off their knowledge of lyrics. These were people finding their own voices within a song that suddenly meant more than entertainment. In the media section, a Rolling Stone journalist who had come to write about gospel music's charitable efforts found himself writing something completely different. "This isn't a performance," he typed into his laptop. "This is church." Whitney felt something she'd been missing for years, the electric connection between artist and audience that had nothing to do with amplification and everything to do with shared truth. These people weren't analyzing her technique or comparing this performance to previous versions. They were worshiping with her. Between verses, something unprecedented happened. The crowd continued singing the chorus even after Whitney had stopped, sustaining the melody and the words as if they couldn't bear to let the moment end. Whitney stood at the microphone, listening to her own song being returned to her, transformed by voices of people whose faith had given it new meaning. When the singing finally died down, Whitney looked out at the sea of faces and saw something she hadn't seen in years. People who weren't waiting for her to entertain them, but who were participating in something larger than entertainment. They weren't an audience anymore. They were a congregation. For her final number, Whitney chose "How Great Thou Art." As she sang about God's power revealed in creation and redemption, the arena became a cathedral. Her voice, weathered by struggle but purified by authenticity, reached every corner with an intimacy that seemed to touch individual souls despite the massive crowd. When Whitney's 15 minutes ended, the response was unlike anything that had greeted previous performers. This wasn't just appreciation for a good show. It was gratitude for being reminded of who they were, for having their faith validated by someone who spoke their language of Sunday mornings and Wednesday night prayer meetings. Backstage, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Musicians who had been politely distant now approached Whitney with genuine respect. "Baby, that was anointed," Aretha Franklin said, embracing Whitney with both arms. "You reminded us all why God gave you that voice in the first place." Kirk Franklin, who had barely acknowledged Whitney earlier, walked over with tears in his eyes. "Sister," he said with a grin, "you just preached without saying a word." Yolanda Adams found Whitney packing up her things. "You know what you did out there?" Yolanda asked. "You showed them that pop and gospel aren't different languages. They're different expressions of the same gift." Whitney paused in her packing. "Yolanda, I've got to ask you something. Why did you really think I belonged here tonight?" Yolanda smiled. "Because I've been watching you for 20 years, Whitney. You've always been searching for home, musically speaking. Tonight you found your way back to where you started. And those church folks, they recognized one of their own." The conversation was interrupted by the family Whitney had spoken with before her performance. The daughter who had challenged Whitney to sing something real stepped forward. "Miss Whitney," the young woman said, "when you sang 'His Eye is on the Sparrow,' my mama started crying. She's been trying to figure out how to tell us she's been losing faith since the storm. I think hearing you sing helped her remember that God still sees us." Whitney found herself more moved by this conversation than by any professional accolade she'd received in years. She looked at the young woman and her parents. "You know what I learned out there tonight? The best songs aren't the ones you perform in concert halls. They're the ones that find their way back to the people who need to hear them most." The next morning, gospel radio stations across America began playing Whitney Houston songs they hadn't touched in years. DJs who had focused solely on contemporary gospel suddenly found room for "One Moment in Time" and "Greatest Love of All." A Detroit station manager said, "We got hundreds of calls from church folks who heard Whitney last night. They wanted more songs that sound like Sunday morning." More significantly, other artists began to take notice. Within months, several contemporary gospel musicians would record covers of Whitney's songs, not as novelty acts, but as serious worship offerings. The artificial boundaries between gospel and inspirational pop began to seem less relevant. Hope for Detroit didn't solve the displacement crisis. Families continued to struggle with starting over. The economic challenges that had necessitated the benefit concert persisted, but something else happened that night. A reminder that authentic ministry transcends categories, that truth resonates regardless of the messenger's journey, and that sometimes 15 minutes is enough to remember why God gave you a gift in the first place. Whitney Houston walked onto that Joe Louis Arena stage carrying the weight of personal struggles and industry skepticism. She walked off carrying something different, the knowledge that her voice was still anointed, that her gift still mattered, and that coming home to your roots isn't about going backward. It's about remembering who you've always been. Years later, when asked about that Detroit performance, Whitney would say simply, "Those church folks taught me something about what matters. They didn't care about my career or my reputation. They just wanted to feel God's presence. That's all any congregation really wants if you're brave enough to offer it." In a world increasingly divided by artificial boundaries, sacred versus secular, church versus entertainment, struggle versus success, Whitney's 15 minutes at Hope for Detroit offered a different possibility. The possibility that music could heal instead of divide, that authenticity could triumph over industry categories, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a performer can do is stop performing and start ministering. The girl from Newark had found her way home.